Hey guys, welcome back to Critical Flick. Today I'm going to review Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer is the newest film from Christopher Nolan, and it details the story and life of Robert Oppenheimer, the creator of the atomic bomb. And that's something I feel like people should really know getting into this film, is it is about Robert Oppenheimer and his life. It really dives into all aspects of his entire career journey. And while this movie does focus primarily on the Manhattan Project and Trinity, it does really dive into aspects before those events and after those events. So I think some people going into this movie expecting it to be really just about that and kind of climax with the explosion of the test, it really isn't that movie. The movie does feel like it's broken up into three distinct phases. In the first phase of this film, we're following Robert Oppenheimer and his growth to becoming kind of the scientific giant that he was at the time. We see his struggles at Cambridge as a troubled student. You get to see really interesting visualizations of kind of the genius thought process. And that was one of my favorite parts of the movie. And I kind of was surprised that they got away from that as the movie went along. You see these moments of him just lost and alone in his bed at night in Cambridge, struggling, missing his home back in America, and then seeing these flashes of light, these swirling colors, this kind of visualization of the working mind. And I don't know if I've seen that in that way in film before, and seeing it on the IMAX screen and kind of the engrossing nature of that was something that really surprised me. It's something I didn't expect from the film. And Cillian Murphy gives a great performance as Oppenheimer, going through all of these experiences. Like I said, going from a troubled student to kind of a giant in the scientific industry, the father of the atomic bomb, to kind of an embattled activist by the end of the film. And I will say, before I go too far in this review, I will be diving into a lot of details of this movie. So if you don't want any spoilers or anything about the movie at all, I would maybe check back later after you've seen the film, because I really want to dive into some of the technical aspects and storytelling aspects of the story, and I feel like I can't do that without kind of spoiling most of the movie. The one thing I will say I think is the biggest criticism of this film is its length. It feels like a very long film. It is 3 hours long. There's no way to really get around that. And I do think the story structure and pacing of the movie doesn't do it any favors. I think it kind of exacerbates the length of the film, because in the first act, we're seeing him as a student kind of understanding quantum physics, trying to bring it to the world, bring it to America. We see Los Alamos, where he's creating the atomic bomb, testing it. And then once it's dropped on Japan, we get another hour or so of kind of his consequences of that and kind of the struggles that go along with kind of the events of that bombing. And it feels like a very natural climax to when they test, at Trinity and explodes. And then you feel like that could have been kind of almost the climax of the film. We'd have a little bit of falling action and move on from there, but it really drags on beyond that. And like I said in the beginning of this video, the movie isn't about that. The movie isn't about the atomic bomb per se. It's about Robert Oppenheimer. And I think that's something that I think some people might struggle with, because it does drag on for so long after that. But those are very important parts of his life. If we stopped it in those moments, you wouldn't get the true story of who the individual was. You would get the idea or kind of the common knowledge of him. And I do like that Nolan dives into those aspects. You can tell he was very inspired by biographies, and just having it kind of deep dive into this character was a very bold move. It would have been a lot easier to make a movie that's just about the Manhattan Project, because the movie in many ways really dives into the interpersonal relationships that Robert Oppenheimer had and how he was a flawed individual. He was this almost godlike figure in the idea of an American scientist, but then when you dive into who he is as a person, he's very flawed. And they talk about this many times with covering up your flaws with brilliance, because he was so brilliant. And he created such a turning point in human civilization. You kind of have post and pre-atomic bomb world. The way that we interact on an international scale, the way we interact with war, was fundamentally changed by this act. It fundamentally changed America's standing in the world and the creation of the UN and all the things that go along with that. So it's kind of focusing on his life and not just the main events, I think really fleshes out the story of who this person was. We learn from the first act his experiences and his political leanings and his interpersonal relationships with people in the Communist Party, which comes full circle by the end of the film. It may feel like it's repeating these things over and over again, but they are a large part of his life and kind of the things that really affected his legacy by the end. Florence Pugh plays Jean Tatlock, who's a love interest that he meets early in his life while he's kind of first getting his reins as a scientist, a world-renowned scientist, and she gives a very phenomenal performance. I think she is a little overshadowed in this film. I think she would have got more screen time, in my opinion. She really is showing someone who is struggling with their own personal demons, their own personal beliefs, and Oppenheimer's brought into that as a flawed individual. He's seen almost as a savior at times in this film. They mention him as a prophet. They often reference religious and mythological text, talking about, Prometheus, or talking about some of the Hindu gods. He is up there with someone who's created something that can destroy the world, kind of the most powerful thing a human has ever done in history. And I think that symbolism and those references are incredibly powerful. Obviously, everyone knows the speech that Oppenheimer gave later in his life when he speaks about what happened when they tested the atomic bomb, and they reference that multiple times in this film. And seeing the human elements of someone who is held on such a high pedestal was really fascinating to me. Obviously, I know there's going to be some dramatization. Christopher Nolan made some distinctions when he was making this film, but I think overall, he's able to encapsulate the entire life of Oppenheimer and understand all the major events that took place, from his beginnings, his very humble beginnings as a scientist in Cambridge, to kind of the world-renowned father of the atomic bomb. And doing so, it creates a really long and a really dense film. And I know that's going to be hard. It was hard for me. I think that's my major criticism, is like, I would have loved for this movie to be just a little bit shorter, but I don't know where you cut it out. I don't know where you remove some of the fat in this film, because it is such an important story, and it is really a vital story about our global civilization and where we are leading and where we could possibly lead in the future. As far as the segments that take place at Los Alamos when they build the actual town where they're doing the testing, I think the production design is fantastic. You expect that from a Nolan film. He doesn't spare any expense in creating practical sets. It looks fantastic. It feels very real. It feels like you're there with them experiencing these things. And even the actual test of the bomb itself was impressive. I mean, you would expect a big CGI explosion, but he's able to take these kind of dark, somber moments and create chaos with them. You're watching the explosion happen almost in total silence, and that creates a vision of awe. And we think back to Robert Oppenheimer's quotes where he says, most people were silent. And I mean, it would be seeing something that you could really comprehend. You're watching something that can destroy the world happen in front of you. And that happens multiple times in the film. We watch our characters get kind of sucked out of reality into their own minds. I think one of the most powerful moments in the film, we have Robert Oppenheimer giving a speech in a gymnasium to a bunch of the co-workers along with him on the project. And you see him kind of leave the moment. He leaves the auditorium and he's there alone, speaking to almost silence, speaking to a void, and he's watching kind of the consequences of his actions play out in front of him. The audience is being burned alive. There's flashes, there's explosions, there's the concept that he's seeing the product of his actions. And I think that was incredibly powerful. We're seeing really dark imagery. We're being taken to a dark, dark place. And that can really define who Oppenheimer was moving forward. After the dropping of the bombs in Japan, he fundamentally seemed against the idea of creating more bombs, creating bigger bombs, and that created a struggle in his life. But you get to see these intimate moments behind the mask of a confident, maybe egotistical scientist to someone who's really guilty, someone who's really struggling with what they've done. And they use that to affect further on in the film. There's moments where Oppenheimer is being put on trial, per se, for his security clearance. He's being decided whether he can get it back or not. And in those moments, he's being flashed back. Whenever he gets a deep, dark confrontation, he's presented with kind of what he has done and what he has created. It's hard for him to get past that. It's hard for him to accept that because it is such a heavy weight to bear. And Cillian Murphy plays those scenes perfectly. You can see it in his eyes. You see the drop of the mask. You see his struggle to articulate, his struggle to look people in the eye when he's a very confident individual for most of the film. Emily Blunt plays his wife, Kitty Oppenheimer, and I would say that she also has probably the second best performance in the movie. She has to play someone who is supportive of an individual that is in many ways constantly hurting her. He's always seems to be cheating. He's always kind of putting himself in front of his family. There's moments where he gives his child to one of his friends because he can't take care of it, because he has to do his work and all the things that go along with it. And she sticks by him through the whole thing, even with him cheating on her, with him doing all these horrible things, because he is brilliant. And she knows he needs to support his work because it is the most important thing that has ever been done. And another thing that I feel like really adds to the film is its score and its use of kind of atmospheric or ambient sounds to drive tension. There's moments where they're working on the atomic bomb where they kind of build in that crackling of the Geiger counter or radiation, and you feel the tension. You feel it mixed in with these booming classic Nolan soundtracks. They're very loud and over the top and overbearing at times, but having that in there kind of adds to it. And they use that multiple times throughout the film of kind of ambient sound around to create swelling feelings of you kind of feel these characters understanding the gravity of what's happening. And as we move into the third act of the film, these are the moments where Robert Downey Jr. really gets to shine. He plays a man named Louis Strauss who's in front of Congress because he's up for a cabinet position. And he's being grilled by them with his relationship with Oppenheimer while he went up against Oppenheimer multiple times. And we get to see a character or an individual that is very much a career politician, a person who is working in the shadows, who throughout most of the film we feel is kind of a comrade, someone who's a friend, someone who's there for Oppenheimer. And we learn along the way that he was pulling the strings in the background to kind of bring him down because of a very vindictive streak inside of him. He gets one scene in particular where he really gets to flex his acting chops, and I think there's potential for him to get nominated just for that one scene alone. And I think when we get this kind of political maneuvering and almost political espionage film, by the end it feels like this movie is split into three different distinct types of films. We get almost a theory of everything, early life and exploration of this character as a scientist. We get a middle section that feels very much like one of my favorite movies of all time, The Imitation Game, and we get a third act that feels very much like a political thriller. So you're getting so many different movies in the same movie that I think that contributes to the length as well. And as we move forward to the final part of the film, kind of the final crescendo of our story, I love that it ends with this conversation between Oppenheimer and Einstein. It's kind of something that's been speculated throughout the film. It gets jumped to in multiple times. It kind of moves some people's motivations, and we get to see kind of a ending or a full understanding of what this movie is really about and what Oppenheimer is really struggling with. And that is when he talks about how they have basically ended the world. They were so worried that when they exploded this bomb that it was going to ignite the atmosphere and destroy the world. And he says, I think in the end that we did that. And I think that's a real exclamation point on the end of our story and really driving forward why it is so important and why we needed to see all segments of it and see all parts of Robert Oppenheimer's life and why he experiences what he does. So if I were to rate Oppenheimer, I would give it a 9 out of 10. I think really the only major drawback for me is its length. And as far as Nolan films go, it's probably in my top 4. It's not my favorite one of all time, but I really appreciate what he went for with this one. It feels like a really kind of cap on his career, if you will. It's something it feels like he's been building with technically and story writing rise to get to something like this. And it is such a monumental film. I think it's something that maybe years and years later that people will come back to that maybe didn't enjoy it and really understand what it is for kind of the big monumental thing it is. So if you checked out Oppenheimer, let me know what you thought about it. I would love to hear your opinions. I would love to see what you think about it, if you like it, if you don't like it. I always love hearing what people think and kind of where it ranks for you with Nolan films. So again, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and see you guys next time.